The next portion of the brain to discuss is the cerebellum. So the cerebellum, which means little brain, because when we were first studying the brain, it looked like there was a large portion of the brain, the cerebrum, and then a smaller portion of the brain called the cerebellum, and since then we've identified many other regions. But the cerebellum is located posterior to the brainstem. So if we look at this image on your PowerPoint, again, I can circle the brainstem right here, and just posterior to it is the cerebellum, which is this region here. And the cerebellum can be divided into two, so it has two cerebellar hemispheres, a right and left cerebellar hemisphere. And if you were to cut right down the middle of the cerebellum, you'd be cutting through what's called the vermis. The vermis is the middle portion of the cerebellum. It kind of connects the two hemispheres together, the right and left hemisphere. If you look closely, especially this picture, you can see that the inside portion of the cerebellum looks white, and the outer layers of the cerebellum appear gray. So this part of the brain also has white matter and gray matter. The gray matter is known as the cerebellar cortex. A cortex is an outer layer. So if you look closely again, the gray matter is on the outside and the white matter is on the inside. The white matter is known as arbor vitae, which means tree of life or living tree. So you got the white matter on the inside, the gray matter surrounding it on the outside. If we were to look from the outside of this portion of the brain, it would look like there are folds. You can kind of see it here, that there's this folding pattern to it. And when you locate the cerebellum, I want you to look at it from the outside, and you'll notice that it has these little folds in it called folia. Function of the cerebellum is really twofold. There are two primary functions. One is to help maintain posture and balance. So in order to do that, you have to coordinate muscles. So the cerebellum helps coordinate muscle activity, but unconsciously. So when we move our body consciously, that's cerebrum. That is a conscious, voluntary control of skeletal muscles. Well, we also control many skeletal muscles unconsciously to maintain posture and balance. That's cerebellum. So we adjust the body by coordinating skeletal muscles. So the cerebellum coordinates rapid, automatic adjustments that maintain balance and equilibrium of the body. It makes these adjustments by modifying activities of motor centers in the brainstem. So we coordinate posture and balance. That's a primary function of the cerebellum. The second primary function of the cerebellum is to help with precise, skilled skeletal muscle movements. So what do we mean by precise, skilled skeletal muscle movements? Well, these are the very, very minor adjustments that our muscles can make to the body. So refined, kind of learned movement patterns is controlled by the cerebellum. So if you're playing the piano, those fine movements of your fingers are largely, again, fine-tuned by the cerebellum. And that also tells you a lot about a pathology. Someone who has damage to the cerebellum is going to have difficulty with these very precise movements. So again, we've covered the white matter, or arbor vitae. We've covered the gray matter, or cerebellar cortex, and the two major functions of the cerebellum. The next area of the brain we're going to cover in this video is the diencephalon. So the diencephalon is basically centrally located in the brain. It's located just above the brain stem. So let's look at this drawing, circle the brain stem again. And we just covered the cerebellum here, posterior to the brain stem. Now we are learning this central location of the brain. And then next we're going to cover this big region called the cerebrum. So the diencephalon. Diencephalon means two brains because when it was identified there was two distinct portions of this part of the brain. One called the thalamus and then a region just below it called the hypothalamus. There's a third region now studied called the epithalamus. So three parts of the diencephalon. The first part, the thalamus, thala meaning inner chamber. It's kind of an inner chamber of the brain. It's also composed of two bodies, and it's connected by what's called the intermediate mass, which connects these two large bodies. So when you cut down the center of a brain, you're actually cutting through the intermediate mass. So I'm going to put a little dot on the intermediate mass. And when you study brain models, quite often you see just a little dot there. That's the intermediate mass that was cut through. So on each side of that, right and left, are larger bodies of the thalamus. So what does the thalamus do? Well, it does a number of things. Like most parts of the brain, there's all kinds of functions dedicated to the thalamus. But kind of the number one function of your thalamus is to act as what I believe your textbook says, and I think it's a great phrase that depicts the thalamus. It's the grand central relay center. What that means is when the brain gets incoming sensory information, it needs to know where this information needs to go, or who can interpret all this information. So what the thalamus does is it knows where this information needs to go to be determined, to be analyzed, to be integrated with memories. Basically, what part of the brain needs to be notified that we've got this sensory input coming into the brain. So that's a good way to think of the thalamus, as a grand relay center. Most sensory information has to get to the thalamus first, and then it gets relayed to parts of the cerebrum. So it relays all sensory signals, a couple exceptions. Olfaction, your sense of smell, doesn't have to go through the thalamus. So it relays a lot of this sensory information to the cerebral cortex, which we haven't learned yet, but that's the part of the brain that analyzes most of our senses. There's other functions. It's involved in consciousness, emotions, learning, memory. So the thalamus does a lot. But again, the number one function is to kind of relay sensory information to regions of the cerebral cortex. Next part of the diencephalon is the hypothalamus. So hypo means below, but this part of the brain is also slightly anterior to the thalamus. So it's inferior anterior to the thalamus. And this part of your brain is really involved in homeostasis. So controlling, regulating conditions of the body. So that's what your hypothalamus does. And a lot of times it does this by controlling endocrine organs, so producing hormones. So this part of the brain is kind of the linker between your nervous system and your endocrine system. So these are the two systems that control almost everything in the body. If you look at any organ in the body, for example your stomach is regulated by both nerves, so the nervous system, as well as hormones. If you look at the heart, well, the heart is regulated by nerves and hormones. So this part of the brain is the linker between the two systems that control the body. How does it control hormone production? Well, it does that by regulating the pituitary gland. Your pituitary gland is known as the master endocrine gland. So that gland is pretty darn important if it's called the master. So the pituitary controls a lot of our other endocrine glands. But it ultimately is controlled by the hypothalamus. So every master has a master. So for example, I consider myself a master of my domain, my household. But we all know that I have a master, and her name is, well, my wife. So the pituitary gland is known as the master, but it is ultimately controlled by the hypothalamus. And therefore, these two organs are always talked about together. And in fact, they're physically connected by a funnel called the infundibulum. Infundibulum means funnel because it funnels hormones from the hypothalamus to the pituitary. And it also kind of funnels neurons down to the pituitary. So the hypothalamus regulates homeostasis. It also controls a lot of autonomic functions, emotions, behavior. It helps regulate body temperature. So our hypothalamus knows that we like to be at a certain temperature, 37 degrees Celsius, 98 degrees Fahrenheit. It also controls our eating and drinking, which are required for homeostasis. So if you don't eat, your hypothalamus is going to do things to make sure that you eat. Some other regions that are part of the hypothalamus. One are mammillary bodies. Mammillary bodies are another kind of mass of tissue. This is what relays smell and taste reflexes. So when you smell something, when you taste something, it gets relayed from the mammillary bodies to other parts of the brain. One other structure to note is the optic chiasm. Chi is the Greek letter X, and the optic means it's optic nerves. So your optic nerves cross before they get into the brain. So if you had two eyeballs, so I'm going to try to draw as if we were looking down at two eyeballs, not anteriorly, we're above the eyes. So your eyes are detecting information, visual stimulus coming in this way. So your pupils might be here and here. So when we're looking at an object, so here's an object, star, and we're looking at that object, our eyes are collecting that visual information. Well, the optic nerves that come out the back of the eyes cross. And they cross just before they enter your brain. So that cross is known as the optic chiasm. It happens to be very close to the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. So quite often we think of that as being maybe the hypothalamus or maybe the pituitary gland, but it's the optic chiasm. So we're going to have to locate that on a brain and make sure we know where to find the optic nerves and where they cross before they enter the brain. So the area where that optic nerves cross. The last part of the diencephalon is the epithalamus, which is above the thalamus, so superior and slightly posterior to the thalamus. And the major thing to look for the epithalamus is a gland that sticks off the back of it called the pineal gland. And the pineal gland produces a hormone called melatonin. Melatonin is a hormone that helps our night and day cycles. It actually is produced more at night, so it kind of helps us sleep. It's a sleep-promoting hormone, so it helps regulate those night and day cycles. People who have trouble sleeping, quite often it could be found that they have low melatonin production. So that's the end of the diencephalon. When we come back, we're going to talk about the cerebrum.